Welcome back. We'll reopen the public meeting now. I'd like to just confirm that Kent Swift is on the line. Kent, are you there?
I'm still here.
Great. Great. Good to hear it. Okay, so just to reconfirm the hijinks earlier today around the agenda. We're going to open the afternoon discussion here with the review of GRI 303, Water and Effluents, followed by a discussion around the GSSB Terms of Reference and Due Process Protocol, and this is item 2.4 that we're taking forward from tomorrow's agenda. Later on, we will be joined for a brief update by Helena Barton of the Independent Appointments Committee. And somewhere in there, we'll have an afternoon break before we close the public portion of the meeting and open up the informational private part of the meeting later on. Okay, so unless there are any discussion or questions about the agenda, I will ask Anna to talk us through the proposed final standard on GRI 303. This is items 7, 8, 9, and 17, in fact, in your packets of information. Thank you.
The clicker is here and the team is here, so I don't want to be facing them with my back. Good afternoon, the GSSB, and similar to what you have heard already in the morning session, we have 3 approvals pending today for the Water and Effluent Standard. Decision 2018.9 to approve the Water and Effluents 2018 Standard with an effective date of 1st January 2021. Decision 1820 to approve that re-exposure of GRI water and effluents is not needed, and decision 1821 to approve the withdrawal of GRI water standard by 31st December 2020. Before we move on to approvals, let me give you just a quick update, or not an update anymore, but an overview of the content that is in the standard and an overview of key changes that have happened to the standard in the past year. So the standard has 3 key disclosures on water withdrawal, water discharge, and water consumption, and these are reflective of the main interactions with water that a company may have and that can cause significant impacts. These largely request quantitative information to understand the full profile of a company's water use. And then there are management approach disclosures, which are context-specific and largely request qualitative information to understand the context behind these numbers, to understand more about the impacts that an organization may have and how it addresses these. So together, topic-specific disclosures and management approach disclosures are designed to give a comprehensive overview and understanding of company water impacts and how it manages them. Each topic-specific disclosure includes recommendations that encourage reporting on best practice approaches and aspirational information. The standard also includes revised guidance, which includes such revised methodologies, references to all sorts of tools to help reporters compile the data. And finally, the standard includes revised and new definitions that bring reporters all to one level of understanding the concepts that are used in the standard. So the key changes that have been made to this standard compared to its 2016 version, first of all, the water discharge content from the effluents and waste standard has been carried over to the water standard after having been revised to understand the overall quality of water that is being discharged and the critical substances of concern that are in this water. New disclosure has been added to report on water consumption, as this is an important metric to understand the volume of water that is not returned to the environment and therefore not available for use by humans or ecosystems anymore. Because water is very context sensitive, new specific management approach content has been added to focus on how water is managed as a shared resource and how impacts are managed at a local level. Greater emphasis has been made throughout the standards and in all 3 disclosures on withdrawal, discharge, and consumption to measure impacts in areas with water stress, to understand impact on the most sensitive locations and help organizations prioritize actions in these areas. New quantitative and qualitative content has been added to report impacts in the supply chain, to start changing the status quo and how reporters continuously underreport and ignore impacts on the supply chain. And finally, a new recommendation has been added to report facility level information for water consumption. As you have undoubtedly noticed in the cover note to the documents that we have sent for this meeting, preparation for this meeting, a few project working group members raised a concern during the final sign-off of the standard around water quality categorization for sources of water withdrawal. And acting in the interest of consensus-based processes, we have worked with these respective project working group members and the full project working group to resolve their concerns. And I just wanted to give you some more detail on how we have resolved them. So several project working group members flagged that in the sources of water withdrawal, in defining them, we have conflated their physical characteristics, which is where water is withdrawn from, so whether either from the source or from the ground or supplied by a third party, with the quality characteristics of that water, so whether that water is fresh or non-fresh. And to illustrate this, we've had sources on, the category fresh surface water and brackish water, and reporters, that created the problem for reporters to place water that was brackish, but that was withdrawn from the surface, so they wouldn't know where to place that. The other concern was around defining the threshold for water, which we have defined at 1,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids, which equates this limit, or equates water with this limit to drinking water quality. And the project working group members flagged that this threshold was found to be too low, as it excludes a large portion of water that may not be of potable quality, but is not heavily polluted either, and therefore can be still used for, or is suited for beneficial uses like agriculture use for irrigation or livestock watering. What we've done is we've revised water withdrawal sources to base them on physical characteristics only, so where the water is withdrawn from surface, from the ground, supplied by a third party. But at the same time, we added a requirement to report the quality of that water by freshwater and other water, where fresh water is defined with the same threshold that we have offered previously of 1,000 milligram per liter TDS, and other water is simply any other water with this limit above 1,000 milligram per liter. And our rationale was that while we agree that water of lower quality needs to be managed, at the moment our research confirmed that there is no established global best practice on what these other categories other than freshwater can be, and more importantly, what constitutes a safe TDS limit for water to be safe for ecosystem use and even for some agriculture activities. At the same time, during the project, there was strong consensus by the project working group that fresh surface water, or freshwater resources, need to be managed as these resources are most scarce and therefore most valuable, so they wanted to have an emphasis on this. And so this proposed solution allows us to understand still what is the pressure on these on freshwater resources, while at the same time allowing reporters to distinguish between any other water that they may be managing and report on that water. And there is flexibility in the standard to report as much information about what these categories are, as long as freshwater resources are reported. This leads us to a couple of areas that we probably should be monitoring in the future, because we have found this topic to evolve quite rapidly, also given the increasing demand for freshwater resources and increasing also pollution and decreasing availability of these resources. So first, we'll continue to look into the categorization of water quality and what new water quality categories evolve, and more importantly, how meaningful they will be in terms of impact on water security for all, while at the same time being applicable to all sectors, such that we can start, or such that we can encourage better management of water that is of not potable quality. We will continue to look into the methodologies for assessing renewable and non-renewable groundwater. In fact, we were considering including a recommendation to report this type of water as a withdrawal source, because several of our project working group members found this to be an important source of withdrawal next to fresh and non-fresh groundwater. We will continue to monitor water stress indicators, and particularly when indicators to monitor water quality will appear under this umbrella of water stress indicators that we have currently put in the standard. And we will continue to monitor cross-sectoral practices for calculating water consumption, as these practices can vary significantly, such that we can offer more methodologies in the standard. I believe Laura has already walked you through the effective date that we propose to be the same for water and effluents as well, which is the 1st of January 2021. And with this, I would like to turn it over for you for any comments or questions that you have on the final standard, which is item 17, and the two draft basis for conclusions that we have submitted, item 8 and item 9. And please note that one of the basis for conclusions, item 9, will change or is subject to change based on GSSB's decisions on the final or latest changes in the standard, but you do not need to approve that draft.
Thank you, Anna. To recap and refresh everybody's memories, this project was, so the draft standard was re-exposed on the basis of work that was done following the first public comment period, because it resulted in some significant changes to the original. And that is why you have two different basis for conclusions documents. So there was one that was drafted with respect to the first public comment period. Content was revised at that point, and then there's a second one. Again, this is a kind of recap of what were the issues that came through during the research, during the discussion of the project working group, and during the public comment process, and a drawing together of the reasons why the final standard is proposed in the way that it is. Once again, the Standards Division has kept us very well informed throughout the process of doing this project, but I would like to ask now, are there any comments or questions on the final standard, which is item 17 in your packet? Let's do the standard itself first before we go to the basis for conclusions. Any discussion on the final standard itself? Okay. Hearing none, how about Kent? I just want to make sure that you're also happy.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool. Okay, thank you. All right, let's turn to items 8 and 9. These are the draft basis for conclusions documents. Any questions or comments on anything that you've seen in those documents? Okay, it doesn't look like it. Now, therefore, we move to the due process elements, which you should all be very familiar with at this point. I am going to ask the head of standards, sitting to my left, to tell us what is your view on whether due process has been met on the development of this standard.
As for the occupational health and safety standard, this standard has moved to all the due process steps that are outlined for a standard in the GSB due process. So we walked through the project identification, commencement, appointment of project working group, development of the proposed standards, interaction with GI board and stakeholder council, public exposure, and consideration of respondents' comments on exposure draft. And as you have mentioned, in this particular case, we had 2 public exposures, and there was the need for re-exposure earlier on in the process. We have implemented all these steps in line with the due process protocol, and due process is met from our perspective.
Thank you very much. Can I ask those in the room to raise their hands if they agree that the standard should be approved with an effective date of the 1st of January 2021? Okay, thank you. And Kent, can I ask for your voice vote of approval if you agree?
I approve.
Great. Thank you very much. So that is resolved. Now, can I ask for consideration as to further need for re-exposure? Bastian, are there any significant changes between the final proposed the exposure draft and the final approved standard that would require re-exposure at this point?
Based on the conversations that we had with the experts, we feel that there is no need for re-exposure at this stage. One disclaimer I would make is it is a standard that will require, as along the lines of what Anna outlined, review rather sooner than later, because the practice is evolving very, very rapidly. Maybe 2 years down the road, this is something where we have to at least consider to write further amendments into the standards. But at this stage, no need for re-exposure.
And of course, that fast-moving nature of it is the reason why we needed to re-expose in the first place, because of the lack of existing standard practices. So therefore, can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree that this standard should be issued as final without re-exposure? Thank you. Kent, can I ask for your voice approval if you agree?
I agree.
Great. And the final piece of due process is, I'd like to ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree to withdraw the 2016 version of this standard, GRI 303 Water 2016, to be withdrawn by the 31st of December 2020. Thank you. And Kent, can I ask for your voice approval if you agree?
I agree.
Thank you very much. Once again, I would like to put on the record the appreciation from the GSSB for all of those who've contributed to the development of this standard, which is a very big improvement over the previous standards. And as Bastian has said, it will continue to be an evolving space for us for some time to come. The members of the project working group, everyone who supplied comments and feedback and insight and advice during the public comment process, and obviously and most especially to the members of the Standards Division team for leading us through this. So thank you very much for that. The next item on our agenda is the discussion we're bringing forward from tomorrow's agenda. This is 2.4, review of the GSSB Terms of Reference and Due Process Protocol. Now, these are items 15 and 16 in your packets.
We're pulling up the slides just now.
Yeah. So, I'd like to give you a little bit of background to all of this. As you're aware, the GSSB was formed in 2015, finalized in this current form in 2015, as a result of a very wide-ranging overhaul of structure and governance at GRI broadly. That is when the development of standards was set up to be independent of the Secretariat and to be overseen by this group. We've now had some experience in working in this form, and it is appropriate for us to stop and take a look at the things that work well, maybe identify the areas that work less well. The timing around this is driven by the fact that the board is undertaking a wider review of governance at GRI during the course of this year for exactly this purpose, to work out what aspects of the governance are working very well, where have we perhaps where have there been perhaps a few oversights in the governance process that could be improved at this point? How can we make sure that what we do is effective and fit for purpose, and ideally as efficient and timely as it possibly can be? So do we have a slide deck for this? Or,
yeah, we have 2 slides.
Yeah. Okay, so would you like to just give us a little bit of the background on this, Bastian?
Yeah, We have started, I think, to collect the feedback internally from the standards division, but also the feedback that we've received from you over time on both the due process and as well as a whole, as well as particularly the interaction with the DPOC. Because that is actually the one governance body that we are interacting most with throughout the process. And I think we have arrived at some preliminary conclusions, and we want to provide that as input to the discussion. A lot more specific comments need to be consolidated here for the document. So in principle, we come to the conclusion that the due process is robust and workable. However, there is a lot of detail in these documents that could benefit from refinement. And there are various examples, and we're listing a couple here on the slide. One is the applicability of full due process to the issuance of interpretations. We've just seen that we have, I think, found a creative solution to get to the market with a much needed interpretation. But to follow the process as it is outlined currently, you could also take the view that you move first a project proposal and then the actual text of the interpretation. You consult with the board and the SC and so on. And by the time you really have an interpretation issue, it takes 3, 4, 5 months, if not more. And to look at the adequacy of all the requirement around issuing an interpretation, that is one area where we have come to the conclusion that we would benefit to find a way that is still staying true to all the public interest and transparent activity that we're all committed to, but at the same time allows us to be responsive to issues that arise in application of the standards. A second item here that we keep coming back to, also based on feedback from stakeholders internally and externally, is the length of public consultation periods. We're currently handling 90 days. In actual effect, we've handled 60 days already to compress the project time frame. And what we've seen, at least for the 2 projects that just got approved, the standards, is the number of responses doesn't seem to be related to the length of the public comment necessarily. 30 days is certainly too short, but 60 days seems to be a workable compromise in between. 90 days is what is handled by most standard setters currently internationally, but the project lifetime of a standard setting process with one of the international standard setters that we probably aspire to compare with is usually also between 2 and 3, if not 4 years. So it is a very different time horizon under which they work. And I think one thing that we continue to learn is that the subject matters that we are dealing with are evolving very quickly, and a 2 to 3 year lead time to develop a standard, probably by the time that you've moved to this process, you can restart the process again. So that's not very helpful, and water is a good example. So one way of looking at timing involved in developing a standard, that is the length of the public consultation. The role of members of the GSB in project working groups. We've looked at this from a standards division perspective. We, of course, appreciate the volunteering effort of the GSB members over and above their regular mandate to be in the GSSB meetings and representing there, to also join working groups. You've seen the team earlier today. We have significant capacity. We will run multiple projects in parallel, and it is we're arriving at a point where there is a question whether each of the GSB members should be serving as a GSB sponsor and whether that's a realistic expectation. Right now, the expectation actually set out in the due process could be interpreted that GSB members would assume a role of chairing specific groups even, which is, in terms of time commitment, not realistic at all in our reflection. There could be a look at that wording to say it is, of course, possible to have this arrangement, but take a bit out that expectation that this is something, a regular duty of a GSSB member. I think you have monthly commitments with the GSB already, currently 2 in-person meetings, and we have to be realistic for what a volunteer can be expected to do under due process. There is, when you review the due process as a whole, there is an issue with the sequencing of the process steps and the descriptions, and that is causing some hiccups, I think, in the dealings with the Due Process Oversight Committee. But also, when we explain our due process, it's not a very linear and a timeline-oriented exercise. So it is confusing for working group members and others that take an interest in that. And it's certainly something we can improve on when we review the due process. And related to that, there is also the possibility to introduce simplification around repetitions and circular references in the document. When you start to read it and you actually follow all the references throughout the documents, you can easily get lost in especially the difference between what is set out as a requirement and what is set out as basically a recommendation on how to implement the working processes. That's for on a high level what we have for the due process. Of course, there's detail to all of that, and we want to discuss that with you now. For the DPOC relationship specifically, we have discussed at earlier meetings that there is a very, very significant commitment from the Standards Division in terms of providing the documentation based on due process to the DPOC so that they can do their job under their mandate to reflect on whether due process has been applied correctly. We're talking really pages and pages of documentation for each of the projects. We've worked with them to simplify that process to a certain extent, but we would still arrive at the conclusion that the level of documentation is very excessive, in particular considering that everything that the GSB is doing and all the approval steps are in the public domain to start with. So we're trying to reduce that as much as possible under the current parameters, but there's certainly something that could be looked at as part of the review. And there are similar learnings, I think, from organizations that have governance structures that resemble the one of GRI, or actually GRI has modeled the governance structure that we have now after their example. So the IFRS Foundation and the FSB, for example, have reviewed their public oversight mechanisms and have come to conclusions around how to simplify these mechanisms. I think similar things can also be observed about the duties of the DPOC members in terms of how much time can they realistically spend on projects now that we start to scale up and have very many projects running in parallel. It's again the clarity of due process in terms of the requirements, but a slightly different take here is what we've seen is in absence of a clear requirement, a lot of interpretation is happening of what could be envisioned by the requirements set out in the due process, and there are additional things that expectations, so to speak, that we perform against when we report back to the DPOC, and that has explained, at least in part, the length of the documentation that we're looking at. There are also due process elements that are completely optional. They encourage practice, like, for example, field testing of standards, but they're not mandatory as such. But then when you have a conversation, of course, with a due process oversight committee that wants to stay true to the letter of a governance document, they would say, so why didn't you do that? And it is fine to explain that for one or two instances, but there are very many of these expectations currently in the due process, and they're not clearly separated from the things that need to happen in any process that we're performing. And the last item is also to look at how we can focus the DPOC in their remit and have them focus really on whether due process has been applied. and not so much an assessment of the contents, that which is the responsibility of this board, or the public interest of the outcome. And there is also, I think, an ongoing debate and to what extent a judgment of the public interest outcome is also the duty of the DPOC. That's a bit in the design, and that requires also attention during the governance review.
Okay. So let's see. We've been through a kind of high-level summary of some of the issues with respect to our own terms of reference, first of all, and then with respect to the due process protocol and the interface with the DPOC. I wanted to open this up for some further discussion. We have been asked by the board and by Eric Hespenheid to come up with quite specific proposals as far as we possibly can as to, to the extent that we have gone through this process and identified where there are challenges or where there are shortcomings or things that could be improved. They'd like to see on the board, they'd like to know exactly what it is that we would suggest be changed about the particular documents and or the process by which they get implemented in practice. There's another set of sort of procedural things that we could look at as well. For example, last month the board met at, and it was around the same time that we asked for their input to draft project proposal documents. The terms of reference require or appear to require the board to provide some feedback to the GSSB on draft project proposals as informed by the stakeholder council, which means it has to go to the stakeholder council. They somehow or other have to discuss it, get some feedback together, give it to the board, and then the board has to give it to us. It creates this sort of process whereby it may be a sort of unnecessary step is what's being proposed here. The stakeholder council could quite fruitfully just directly advise us at the same time as the board could consider their feedback as well. We have further process issues around the timing of some of these things because of the frequency of our meetings and the regularity of the work that we do versus the frequency of board meetings, which is much less than our frequency. So if we do want their feedback on things, we somehow or other have to get them to them with much longer lead times than we typically are able to because they're only meeting once a quarter. So, there are some of these steps that could also be refined and finessed in order to improve some of our process. But maybe on some of these higher level issues, do you want to click back to the previous slide, Bastian? I'd like to open this up for some discussion around your experiences in what does this look like to you from your perspective? How well does the process of creating and improving standards work? Julia.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think the one that immediately struck me, the length of public consultations, I think moving that to 60 days or whatever the recommendation is makes a lot of sense. I think 90 days, it's easy for people not to feel a sense of urgency in sharing their feedback. So I think shortening that would be helpful to get feedback and make it timely.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Zulema?
I have something to say about the role of members of GSSB in project working groups, because it's not mandatory, it's a voluntary role. So for me, it did not create a not realistic expectation of my time commitment. I'm very happy to be part of the Human Rights Technical Committee. But maybe we should stress, when asking for volunteers, that it could raise the time commitment. And then those who are not very aware of their time commitment or not aware of the amount of extra work to do, maybe should rethink their hands raising.
Well, and I would add to that discussion, Sulema, the fact that we do, among the members of the GSSB, have different obligations, different demands on our time, and some people will be more able than others will be to devote time to any number of things. If we have set a precedent whereby project working groups and technical committees so far have been sponsored by GSSB members working in a certain way, which is to say attending every meeting, essentially participating fully as any other member of those working groups or technical committees would do, it would raise questions as to, is that in fact the requirement for project working groups and technical committees to have that level of participation specifically from GSSB members? And if so, it really does limit who is able to participate in those, and by extension, who's able to participate in the GSSB. And I would question whether or not that was really the intention when inviting, and creating the space for GSSB participation in some of these working groups. I think it would be problematic for us to have too great a range of experiences in practice where you have one working group where a GSSB sponsor sort of, read the documents and participated in one meeting versus another one where a GSSB member participated as an independent expert on an issue, attended every meeting, gave significant feedback and oversight and direction and so forth. Those look like two different things to me. And I think we should be quite clear what the requirement is for the development of standards as far as that, given that we on this body have an obligation to read all the documents and to be informed by the discussion that has taken place at project working groups. Do we have to repeat it in a sense? Evan.
I was just going to say, I looked at this when I knew this topic was coming up because I think it's very vague in the original terms of reference what the actual responsibility of the GSSB member in terms is with the project working groups. It's not defined very clearly. Perhaps we should revisit the terms of reference in order to make the relationship more clear, even if we're not defining exactly who has the time to do what. But I agree that you couldn't, if as prospective board member, for example, looking at this and seeing the work that's expected of you, you have no idea how many hours you're committing to in that one line item.
Oh, sorry, Dwight, yes, please go ahead.
On the 60 hours, that's probably reasonable, but we have to consider two things. One is the constituency that might offer comments on some of our exposed standards might not be aware that they are being exposed at that moment. You need a percolation time for interested parties to become aware that there's something that's affecting their interest. And so I just offer that as a caution in terms of there is a reason why there was a longer period of time than is necessary, and I think that's one of the reasons. But that can also be overcome somewhat, I think, by within each standard trying to make sure that the notifications of potentially interested parties go out to it. So there's so I think what you can do is shorten the time and take some additional steps that way. I think this business of the board member participation is, I certainly appreciate the some of the problem of, say, providing a reasonable expectation of what a GSSB member would be expected to do. But I also think that I think that the board needs to go beyond just oversight in a very general way. I think that when this board was created, I actually expected a good deal of the standard setting to be done by the board itself, and I think that needs to not be lost. I don't think this is a body that just approves a committee and then approves the result of that committee. I think the involvement has to be significantly deeper than that. You know, and I think, so what I'm saying is I think maybe this is something we need to discuss further. But it isn't obvious to me that that's the problem that it's so obvious to others on. But anyway.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't think we're saying different things here, or at least I don't feel that we are. In my view, this group, as I said, has an obligation to read all of the proposed drafts, to read the updates from the working group meetings, and to be informed all along the process as to the specific content. And our review and approvals requirements are very much content focused as much as they are process focused in my view. And to my mind, it's very useful having a GSSB member who can serve as a liaison, because sometimes when we have these discussions here, we don't know what informed the development of a particular form of words on the page that we're reading. But if we have one of our members who is there, they're more able from day to day to kind of keep that link fresh. I would question whether it's feasible or desirable for us as the GSSB to essentially recapitulate the work of the working groups. You know, that there's the kind of it has to be a dialogue as opposed to a sort of repetitive process, and I slightly worry about getting that balance right, and I don't think that it's very clear in the documents as to what that looks like. I would also just point out that just as far as the time obligation is concerned, Kent is very bravely and magnanimously on the line because he came to Amsterdam a few weeks ago with the tax and payments to government group and felt that he could not make a second trip to Amsterdam for the core GSSB meeting. And so I would sort of put it out there that actually there will be people who will need to make trade-offs about their time investments. Is that what we're looking for? Is that what we're expecting? And how do we make this feasible for people? I think Kent is I'll just put you on the spot here, Kent, but I think you're a rare individual to be participating in the phone in the middle of the night. When I'm not entirely sure that a lot of other people would do it. So I think there are multiple sort of challenges around this that need to be teased out and made more explicit. Julia, and then Dwight.
It just strikes me, just what you said and what Evan said before, if we can get to what is the core absolute minimum requirements for board members in terms of functions, and maybe just start there, because I think the piece around the working groups, that makes sense to me, but it makes it tricky for individuals, is that, you know, GSSB members should sponsor working groups that relate to their areas of expertise, but if somebody's area of expertise comes up, you know, every single time and their term is on the board, that's not so great from their own time perspective. So I think there's a piece of that can't really be managed centrally, but at least if we have a sense of what are the you know, core things to start with and then build from there. That's my recommendation.
For me, it's a short comment about the role of the GSSB members in project working groups, which I have not done yet, but which I will do for the waste standard. In my opinion, it's quite healthy to have a working group and some form of other committee as the GSSB, which doesn't have, in French we say le nez dans le guidon, or the nose in the handlebar, and so sees a bigger picture. And I don't see a better way to manage communication between the two than to have, well, representatives of the working groups that come to the GSSB, and at least one representative of the GSSB which can, if only just witness how the group works, and then attract attention of what the GSSB as a board would require to see, or what they believe is important, and also facilitate the dialogue between the two.
Thank you. Okay, I think I've got Dwight and Sulema.
In terms of looking at what we're talking about right now, I've heard that the GRI board is looking at governance, and I've heard that we are expected to, provide some kind of comment to the board in that activity. So I have two questions. One is a timeline question, and the other is a process question. And what I'm thinking of is maybe what we need to do is have the Secretariat provide us something along these lines that we could sort of annotate and develop into an agreed statement to the GRI board or something like that. Would that be right?
Yes, I believe so. I believe there are different types of challenge. However, there might be some low-hanging fruit that we could present in significantly worked through form for the board for more short-term consideration. There are some bigger issues that will need to be taken on board alongside the wider review of governance, which I mean, I think the basic review will take more or less the rest of this year, and then what happens with it would probably at that point still remain to be worked out by the board. But if there are things that we think can be actioned by the board without creating significant impacts in other ways for the organization or for our stakeholders, the board would be grateful for us to identify what we think those might be. Did you want to respond?
To respond to what you've just said, yes, there might be low-hanging fruit, and I think certain things that are obvious and not particularly controversial and can be done right away. I don't think the relationship of the board, the GSSB, to the project committees is low-hanging fruit, and I'm not sure it's the business of the GRI board either. So maybe in the process thing, we first of all divide the low-hanging fruit from other fruit. And then develop it in a timeline with something. But I would like to, as a board member, have a look over anything the board sends to the other board.
Absolutely. That is absolutely agreed. Sulema.
There's another issue in terms of time commitment within the paragraph 38 of the terms of reference for GSSB. I'm not sure if I fully understood what is this paragraph in terms of what we should approve. Should we approve the translation of every single standard and document? No. We should approve someone to translate the documents that we are approving here in English? Because for me, it's very confusing. It might be a language problem, but
I think it's probably a formulation problem. So the GSB can publish authoritative translations, which in actual fact we've started to do in the sense that we are commissioning these translation projects. And there is the option here to publish translations together with others as well. Both are options that are given as mandate to the GSSB, but that's it. But it does not involve an approval of individual translations.
Then the board is giving the mandate to others to translate the documents, right? So this is the thing. I cannot remember when this board was giving the mandate to others to translate documents.
We haven't done that.
We have done it.
We haven't done that.
We haven't.
We haven't done that to translate. We've always maintained the oversight of the project. We have worked obviously with translation agencies and organizations that translated, but the oversight of the project was always with GI.
So thank you, Master. I'd add something about this document in terms of reference. There are some words that need to be replaced because are not accurate. So in the paragraph 8, the 4th bullet, where especially of relatively weak in comparison to others, people or groups are vulnerable, not weak.
I'm sorry, can you say again?
Yes, in the first bullet within the 2nd page, there's ensuring that no person or community is either overlooked are marginalized, especially of relatively weak in comparison to others. This is not a proper word to refer to people who has less power. It's vulnerable people or vulnerable groups. And the other issue in this document, it's about geographical representation. It's stated in paragraph 19 and sorry, 19 and in other place of this document, but it's not explicit within the paragraph 12. We have to include diversity in terms of geographical representation.
I see. Yeah, I see. So yes, there are. Yeah, there are some various mentions made of the desire to embody diversity.
To seek for diversity,
Yeah,
yes.
without a kind of explicit requirement for certain levels of representation, apart from the stakeholder category
Yes.
sort of balance issue.
But it's a matter of standardization of the document,
Okay.
the whole document.
Okay.
Thank you.
I do recall, just for the record, I do recall a very labored conversation around point 8, the definition of the public interest. Others may recall this as well. So, well, I mean, point taken, and we'll certainly take note of this as something to ensure remains fit for purpose. Dwight, yes, please.
I recall very well that labored conversation over public interest. And I think there was an initial misunderstanding at the time GRI was restructured as to its meaning. And I'll be very interested and concerned if that confusion is reborn.
Okay. On this particular one, the GSSB terms of reference, have we had enough discussion? Should we go on to the due process and DPOC at this point? What would you, Bastian, what would you find useful in order to get to the stage where, as Dwight was saying before, we have some proposals for the group to actually work very closely with?
I think what's helpful for us at this stage is to collect your thoughts on the documents, and what we will bring back to you is probably to stay in this fruit picture, the low-hanging fruit in terms of proposed edits to the documents already to the next meeting, and then also an inventory of discussions and recommendations that you would make that are more substantive in nature and would probably have to be taken up by various governance bodies for discussion that are affected. And that's something, I think, in terms of markup of documents, that's something that we can provide between now and the May meeting, because there is a timeline question here as well, and the board is meeting, I think, the next time in June. And since they're on a quarterly schedule, if low-hanging fruit is to be picked here, then this needs to happen for the GSB and the scheduling of the GSB within the next months. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another almost rotten fruit, there are some references to a timeline that's in the past. So in paragraph 21, it's first round of rotation. We're going to have our 4th round of rotation, right? Yes. And paragraph 37, there's a reference to 2016. So it's rotten fruit, not low-hanging fruit.
Indeed, it's in the past. It's not wrong. It just happens to be
No,
behind
I know,
us
but
now. So maybe there's even within the non-low-hanging fruit, there could be degrees of a sort of challenge that's presented by various things. There might be some places where it's a little more difficult than just, oh, that makes perfect sense, let's just do it next month type of thing. Versus things that really require sort of fundamental rethinking. Have we actually got something wrong with the kind of basic setup here that really needs to be opened up again? Dwight?
Yeah, it's just a thought. Often low-hanging fruit goes the way of people who believe in things such as win-win. I mean, it doesn't always happen. It's more theoretical than in practical experience.
I think the proof of the fruit will be in the fruit salad or something like that, so we'll find out. Should we move on then to the due process protocol document and the discussion around the relationship with the DPOC? I think some of you will recall having seen a variety of extremely long documents which the Standards Division team spends a huge amount of time constructing in order to demonstrate, according to the due process, that we have upheld the principles of GRI's commitment to due process and to the public interest in the practice of everything that we do. The effort that's involved in doing that does not only fall on the Standards Division, it also falls on the DPOC, who themselves, I think it's fair to say, are not particularly interested in getting many hundreds of pages of documentation. They're interested in making a good decision. And so far, the effort to assist them in making a good decision has kind of turned out to in practice require an enormous amount of documentation that may or may not really be necessary. So I think it would be very welcome across the piece, you know, in terms of all of GRI's governance bodies, to try to ensure that this is fit for purpose and that we have. It seems to me one of the big problems is that there's actually a lot of interpretation in the due process protocol around what some of the expectations may be. We have identified here the need to more clearly define which elements of the due process are optional. You know, I would possibly put it out there that anything that's in the due process shouldn't really be considered optional, and having optional elements of due process is possibly beyond what makes sense for a procedural sort of a document like this, and therefore anything that's in the due process should be something that should be considered a requirement. I would put that out there for discussion, for example. That's not necessarily the case or shared by the rest of you. Evan.
Just to revisit a banana from the last discussion. So A12 seems to me to be the crux of the argument here when it comes to the GSSB participation in these project working groups, where, to Bastian's point earlier, is usually chaired by a GSSB member. So the expectation of labor there is a lot stronger here than it is in the terms of reference. And maybe we're thinking about this backwards instead of what the role of the GSSB is in terms of the project working group. Maybe there's room in terms of the definition of the makeup of the project working group itself to create a liaison type role for the GSSB member to participate as a witness, as a participant, but without having some of the labor burdens of being a full committee member or full project member.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just and it is a reality in conversations with interested candidates for a role on the GSB. This has come up. Stakeholders that have contacted us and they've been reading the governance document and say, well, one thing is that you're meeting 10 times a year, but I read that there is also a chair function, and how often does that happen? And I think in a conversation we're always able to put an end to that in terms of making it a prohibitive element, but it would be much better to have a clearly set out expectation as to what GSB members are doing here.
Dwight, are you about to? Yes, you are.
Obviously, we'll get back to this debate later on, but my concern about this particular issue on the relationship of the GSSB to those committees it creates is partially that the GSSB needs to control that, and therefore, for instance, maybe that you might work it out that when the GSSB creates a committee, they can decide whether it should be chaired by a GSSB member or not, as the case may be. But the power still resides within the GSSB. I'm just offering this as an example because it just occurred to me.
Okay. Is it premature at this point, Bastian, to ask, has the standards division, I mean, you flagged here that some of the other standards bodies out there have also done governance reviews. Is it premature to ask at this point whether we know what the content of those is and anything that we could inform ourselves with now around this discussion?
As today, well, I think it was probably too involved to go into the detail because they are slightly different in terms of setup. But the good thing about these documents, they are in the public domain because they are public interest standard setters as well. So we can probably, to inform a discussion, especially on that DPOC aspect, we can share the document, but also highlight the relevant findings from these reviews. I think that there's generally been a trend to look at an oversight mechanism. Some are focused on public interest, some are focused on due process. And I think across the board, the issue seems to occur that one is the level of documentation, the delaying of projects because you have an involved interaction of two governance bodies. And on top of that, then also an issue around interpretation of the actual wording. That is how I would summarize the two references that we have here. But we can prepare that in more detail. I think it would be too involved to go into that right now because we would have to explain the two governance structures of the different institutions as well.
I think in practice there might also be some fruits, shall we say, in the due process protocol that could be attained by looking at the kind of relative emphasis of things or the way that things have been actually interpreted in practice. So, for example, we have in the due process protocol, there is a provision for a grievance mechanism so that if any stakeholder, external, internal, wherever, has a problem with any of the pronouncements of the GSSB or any of the standards or contents that we create and approve and feels that we didn't do it correctly or didn't come up with the right result according to our own principles and processes, they can raise a grievance in a manner that is provided for in this document. Perhaps if there were a little bit more reference to that fact, a little bit more reference point around what that means and looks like, it might take a little bit of the requirement out of having to kind of rehash conversations in order to demonstrate that we did follow due process, if that makes sense. And there may also be there may also be ways that we can kind of emphasize the content and the nature of what the decisions are that the DPOC needs to take so that they can focus less on things such as the content of standards or, for example, who the specific participants have been in working groups or technical committees, or whether we came up with a particular result or didn't come up with a particular result. If that's not the intention of the due process, then we should make it as easy as possible for the DPOC to focus on what is the intention of the due process. And that obviously will have to be in dialogue with the board as well. Any other observations or thoughts on this particular topic?
Should I summarize next steps?
Yes, why don't you think that would be very helpful, a summary?
So what we will do is we take the comments that you have given now. We will go back and actually, I think we will produce two contents for review. One is actually an annotated version of the two documents that you're looking at here. Maybe with that distinction that we're in the first round address the low-hanging fruit and those things that are obvious around cleaning up the document, suggestions that are not affecting other governance bodies and are not significantly changing the remit of the GSSB. For those things that are more involved, we would actually start to develop an outline for a recommendation as per Dwight's suggestion, that there is a document that can be reviewed by the full GSSB and can be worked out on collectively so that we get to a set of recommendations that we want to issue to the board. And depending on how quick we are in arriving on conclusions on the second document, that will define whether we can submit it for the next meeting of the GI board, which is in June, and that would require, Tina, correct me if I'm wrong, it would require probably submission by end of May. Yeah, I think so. Yes, yeah, end of May, early June to the GI board. Yeah. So you will see this resurfacing as a discussion item for May. In the first instance with an annotated version, as well as a first take at consolidating different recommendations. But the latter one will be incomplete, and there is where more discussion needs to happen. And the meeting is 20.
Yeah, I believe it's the 26th.
26th.
Is our next
Yeah, okay.
meeting. It's the 26th of April is what I'm looking at here. Do we not have an April meeting?
I don't. Tina,
Have
can
we
you
can- have we
confirm that?
canceled
I'm sorry, I
still
should have
holding
looked
it in my diary if I, yeah. There,
So it's 31st of March, the next meeting. Yeah,
Third-
31st of March is
May.
then, yeah.
31st.
Sorry, May, yeah, March.
31st of
That
May.
that would be nice. We have about a year to prepare this document for you. No, it's 31st of May, and that is when you will have that document from us. So 10 working days in advance.
so- Robin?
So I just had a quick question. Does the, do we have like a flowchart version of the due process protocol? I know that's a...
Yeah, we're working, that's one of the simplifications of flowchart, but a staging of this. That's how we want to work with the DPOC also increasingly. But one of the elements that we've been struggling with, there are due process steps, and the way they're described in the document, they're actually referring to the whole process. They're overlapping. Some can be only concluded at the end of the process, despite the fact that most of the elements of that particular due process steps are occurring early in the process. So that's a bit convoluted at the moment. So it's not a simple step-by-step linear process that you can outline here.
So I was just wondering if that exists in its current form, it would probably, even if it was documented as a flowchart at the moment, it would probably highlight really quickly where our various fruits are fitting, to extend the metaphor as far as I can. But that would probably highlight where there's some serious overlaps or excesses of process that we could address, I guess. It's just, I was just wondering if other people might find that useful too. Certainly I would, in terms of how those sort of processes work in my own mind.
Evan?
Well, yes, I agree, and I think it would actually be a useful public tool. It's one of the questions I get asked a lot is what is the process for approval of standards? Sometimes a visualization, especially on the public website, might make a difference in terms of the understanding of the steps that people go through and how the sign-offs are, worked into this process over a period of time.
Yeah, I think this is also a concern that the team has, that we should be more, we should be providing the right resources, visual resources on the website, maybe just a short animation of what it looks like to generate a GRI standard, right, as per due process. And I think we have been slow in making this available. Yeah.
I think that there is, in the business community, there is a bit of a perception that a secret body deliberates somewhere and then issues a standard and it comes out 6 months later. And I don't think there's really an appreciation sometimes from the business community about the amount of rigor and discipline that goes into the process.
Just want to formally agree with that statement. Well said.
And maybe that's an action item then that pertains a bit to this discussion, but we could actually make that a formal action item for that we follow up with our comms function. We actually just generate this resource now, and that's not a commitment for May. given our resourcing on the communications department, but certainly it's still mid-year that should be possible, and we'll prioritize that. That's a good suggestion.
Thank you. Right, Dwight.
Yeah, I don't think the GRI is that kind of non-financial reporting standards body.
Would you like to elaborate? No?
There might be others.
Other reflections on the due process? I mean, I think as Bastian said at the beginning of this session, the kind of initial review would suggest that it's basically fit for purpose. You know, it basically works and delivers the results that we want it to. We want it to be a bit faster, a bit more responsive, a bit more transparent, easier for people to take part in it, and less open to interpretation, and thereby, you know, strengthening the work that we're doing. So, shall we give the GSSB some timelines around providing further feedback and so forth? Have we clarified to your liking, Bastian, as to when you would like to receive any further remarks from GSSB members in order to inform the creation of draft?
Yeah, I think if you could submit further feedback that you might have in the next 2 weeks, that would be appreciated. I think realistically we're only getting down to annotate and draft a recommendation paper by early May. Okay. So 2 more weeks for you to submit any feedback that you might have on this. It can be also detailed on the documents itself, annotated PDF, and then we will take that forward.
As detailed as possible, please. Vincent.
Yeah, I just have a quick questions about the presentation of the due process. I personally like the flowchart, because it is easier to identify the results and the input and the output. So I'm not quite sure whether it's feasible to, in the future, to draft the due process in a chart, in the process flowchart, because it's just like a 14 pages document, and it's not easy to identify the gaps, and also it's easier will be in the future to revise it or in some way.
Yeah, that's certainly, I think, a combination of text and flowchart, and that's certainly something we can look at. It goes back to my earlier point that right now, the way it's set up, it is difficult to depict it in that way, but we can certainly have a look what's possible there. I think overall there is, for one of the criticisms that GI has received with the governance changes is that there is no good depiction of the overall structure and how the different governance bodies relate. That's one. And then actually when you then look at what are the mandates of the different governance bodies, there is that visual lacking as well. And so we could make a first attempt to sort that out for the standard setting aspect of it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And the next 2 weeks, please be thinking, as specifically as you can about any feedback that you have or recommendations that you would like to make into this wider discussion. Would it be possible to get Helena Barton on the line a little bit early? Maybe we can just check that. Okay. Okay. In the meantime, do we have any logistics or possibly, as you know, we have taken one of this most recent discussion that we've had came off of the proposed agenda for tomorrow. So if we have a quick look at what remains of tomorrow's agenda, we're going to start with, before the public session opens, we're going to have a briefing with Tim Moen, the GRI Chief Executive. We will have a more significant review of the work program at that point. you know that we have already published a 3-year planned work program. We're in the middle of that period right now, and we're going to have a look at what's been achieved and what hasn't been achieved, and sort of timing and prioritizing at that point. We also have, again, not in the public meeting, we'll have a briefing with the GRI network engagement team to talk about some of the programs that they are planning or have underway at the moment that have some relationship with the standards for our information, and to think about what the how we can support this activity to make it as robust as possible. We'll also have an opportunity after we have our informational session this afternoon to talk about whether or not there are other things that people want to sort of put on the agenda, either for tomorrow or for the future discussions for GSSB. Is there anything else that, no, okay. Any word from Helena? Not yet, okay. Maybe what we'll do is we'll take a quick break here. So 5 minute, we'll just turn off the line for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to it and hopefully pick that up again quite quickly. Thank you.